If you grew up in the suburbs, you were probably a decent distance away from nature. I'm not talking about a park or a pond or anything like that, but real deep woods nature. Get away from everything kind of nature. I know I was. Where I grew up, the closest natural camping area was at least 4 hours away. My family had a history of camping. We usually went to the river a few times a year, and a few local campsites a few more than that, but we never really got off the grid. Our campsites always had showers, dumpsters, and piped-in water. Fish and game would always patrol at night, campers and RVs as far as the eye could see. It was fun. I loved being outdoors. I would beg my parents to let me camp in the backyard, but they always held a firm line. You're not old enough to take care of yourself yet. When I was about 16, I turned a corner in my parents' mind. I was cleaning up after myself, doing my homework right away, helping around the house. I was maturing right in front of them. I was taking care of myself. This time, when I asked if I could camp outside, they sighed and agreed. I was so excited. For my birthday that year, my parents had got me a small, 2-person pop-up tent. They said I was ready to sleep alone on our camping trips, but I think they just wanted some privacy, and I did not want to ask why. That was between them and God, and I was happy to stay out of the equation. I planned on staying outside for a 3-day weekend. We had Friday off school because of a local holiday, and I spent the day setting up my site. I cleared the land, set up my tent, went grocery shopping for camping food, and my parents even let me dig a little fire pit. When the sun began to set, I said goodbye to my parents, hiked the 50 feet to my campsite, and started a little fire. I ate about half a dozen s'mores. I kept the fire going until around midnight. I spent that time reading comics by the lantern light and staying warm. What I noticed is how different familiar places look in the dark. My house was only a stone's throw away from me, but it looked completely foreign in the pitch black. When my parents finally shut down for the evening, around 11 or so, it looked even more strange. Even in the suburbs, nature has a way of creeping in, especially at night. Just outside your warm little room, the night awakens all kinds of creatures. The crickets sing, owls fly and hoot, raccoons and possums crawl along the ground, dogs around the neighborhood bark and howl in the distance. A lot happens without you even being aware. When I started yawning, I decided that I'd probably had enough. I doused my fire with sand and closed up for the night. I crawled inside my tent, zipped it up, and laid in my sleeping bag. As crickets chirped outside, I slowly drifted off to sleep. Then I heard it. Cliché as it might sound, I heard a stick snap in my yard. I wasn't worried right away. It could be any number of things, but I did open my eyes and listen a lot closer to what was going on outside my tent. I heard the wind blow and the trees in my backyard rustle, but nothing that sounded like a person walking around. I debated getting up and going outside, but my rational brain kept me in check. If it was a person and they wanted to do me harm, what could I possibly do? I laid my head back down and closed my eyes, but I knew there was no way I was going to fall asleep anytime soon. I kept my ears open and listened for anything out of the ordinary. Any other twig snapping or someone walking through a pile of leaves or something. After 15 minutes or so, satisfied I hadn't heard anything out of the ordinary, I finally drifted off to sleep. When you sleep outside, you wake up when the sun comes out. For me, that was around 6:30 in the morning, and I was not exactly pleased. I had a rough night's sleep, and not nearly enough of one. I needed to go to the bathroom, so I put on my flip-flops, unzipped my tent, and walked out. That's when the blood drained from my face. Just outside the door of my tent, there were a few footprints. They were hard to see because most of my yard is grass, but in the dirt from my freshly dug fire pit, I saw two as clear as day. They weren't mine. They were huge. My heart nearly came out of my chest, my mouth went dry, and my brain felt fuzzy. There was someone outside my tent last night, and I didn't know. Did I almost die because I was too afraid to check it out? I felt my legs start to wobble a bit, but I caught myself. I sprinted towards my back door, careful not to look behind me. I whipped open the door and was surprised to be greeted with the smell of bacon. My parents were already up and cooking breakfast. They turned to welcome me, but when they saw my chalk-white face, they paused. "You okay, honey?" my mum asked. Yeah, I'm fine," I lied. "You don't look fine," my dad added. "Rough night's sleep is all. I think the neighborhood dogs were excited by the moon or something." "Okay," my mum said, not believing a word I said. "We made some breakfast to surprise you, but you came bursting in here." "Oh yeah, I have to go to the bathroom," I said, and walked out of the room. I went into the bathroom and splashed water in my face and took several deep breaths. I was fine. Nothing happened. I needed to keep my cool, or my parents would never let me do anything like this again. I told myself I was being dumb, and nothing happened. I almost believed it myself. When I sat down to eat my food, my dad looked over at me and smirked. "What?" "You're a loud snorer," he said with a chuckle. "You heard me from out there?" I said, shoveling eggs into my face. "No," he said, looking away. "I came out last night to check on you." "Dad, we wanted to make sure you were okay," Mum added, "and it was. You'll understand when you have kids one day." "When did you come outside?" "Around 1ish, I think." Then the tumblers clicked. "Wait, where did you stand to listen to me?" "In front of your tent. Why?" I started laughing. It was my dad. Of course. I nearly shot eggs out of my nose. My parents looked at each other and then back to me. "I had a dream I saw you," I said, lying. "I must have seen you outside my tent." "Not as quiet as I thought," he said, taking a bite of toast. "I guess not," I said, catching my breath. "Seriously though, I'm fine. Last night went off without a hitch. Tonight will be no different." They nodded in agreement. I felt fine again. I took a swig of OJ and could feel my entire body relax. There wasn't anyone out there. Why would there be, in the middle of suburbia? As the night fell, I once again got a good fire going. I used the stick rubbing method, which took forever, but eventually got going. I wanted to test myself to see if I could get something going for when I eventually did off-the-grid camping. It took a minute, but the food I cooked over the flame that night tasted sweeter because of it. That night was a new moon, and it was pitch black. The only light was my fire, which I kept burning bright, and my gas lantern. After I had finished reading my book for the night and doused my fire, I decided to walk the backyard. Not totally sure why I wanted to do this, but I felt compelled. I started in the front right corner and worked my way around the fence counterclockwise. If my neighbours saw me, they'd assume I was up to no good, but thankfully they were old and it was late. I didn't see anything along the fence, which was not surprising. I don't know what the hell I expected to find, but I kept going. When I got to the far right corner, I stopped and stared into the backyard of the neighbours directly behind us. I couldn't see much. They had a line of hedges that worked like a privacy fence. The people that lived there were new to the area, and my parents had met them and chatted between the fences. They seemed nice. The backyard was spotless. As I moved along our cyclone fence, I noticed something clinging to the top railing. I swung my lamp around and saw a clump of dried mud that looked like it had been scraped on the metal. I walked over and touched it, and it crumbled and fell to the ground. That's when I saw footprints. the same ones I had seen in the morning in front of my tent. Someone had been there, and it sure as hell wasn't my dad. I froze and didn't know what to think. I suddenly became very aware that I was alone in the darkest night of the month. I decided not to check out the rest of the fence and slowly walked backwards towards my tent. I didn't know if anyone was watching, but I wanted to be ready to run in case they were. Then I heard the gate to my backyard open. In a flash, I quickly shut off my lantern. The darkness was sudden and terrifying. I wanted to run to my house, but whatever was back here now was closer to the back door than I was, and they would absolutely catch me. I was stuck. I dug down and squatted down along the fence line. I held onto my lantern because, if it came down to it, I was going to bash this into the face of whatever the hell had come into our yard. I didn't realize it at first, but I had started to shiver from fear. Whoever walked into my backyard didn't close the gate behind them. My guess was they wanted it for an easy escape route for when they finished. I didn't even want to think about what they wanted to finish. My eyes started to adjust to the darkness, but I still could barely make out anything. I saw my tent, the fabric wavered a bit in the breeze, and then I saw a figure walk near it. It was a man, and he was big. He moved slowly, methodically around the tent. He was like an animal stalking its prey. I had kept the window and door all zipped up, and if he was going to get in, he was going to have to risk unzipping the tent and waking me up. The man stopped and stared back out at the house. Then he took something out from his waistband. It was a knife. He slowly moved away from the tent and made his way over to the back door. I knew it was unlocked because my parents wanted a way for me to come inside if I got too cold or scared. He was heading inside and my parents were fast asleep. I needed to do something, but my mind was all over the place. I heard him walking up the deck stairs towards the back door, and I knew I was running out of time. I grabbed my lantern and tossed it as hard as I could to the opposite side of the yard. It landed with a smash on the ground. The man stopped and looked over in the direction of the noise. He turned away from my back door and ducked down. He waited a few seconds, and then slowly started towards the noise. I looked over and saw the shovel I'd used to dig the fire pit. Thankfully, I was just irresponsible enough to have kept it out. I slowly started moving back towards the tent at the same time the man was walking towards the broken lantern. I knew I didn't have a lot of time, and I had to grab the shovel and hide before he realized it was just a lantern and not a person. Before he knew, he was being watched too. I was as quiet as I've ever been, my eyes moving back from the shovel to the man. I took shallow breaths and kept moving. As soon as I grabbed the shovel, I dug down and made my way to the back of the house. I hid along the wall, doing my best to blend along with the shadows. The man got to the fence line and picked up the broken lantern. He turned and headed back towards the tent. I was stunned at how fast he moved. In a few strides, he stood outside the back of the tent. I saw him raise the knife and then slice along the fabric. I could hear it tear from where I was sitting. Then, with violence I have not ever witnessed since, he stabbed down violently into my sleeping bag, again and again. He was focused on making whoever was in that tent pay. My legs felt like jello, my mouth was dry, and I could barely catch my breath. But I knew I had to do something, and my window for action was closing. If I didn't get him now, while he was distracted, I was never going to get him. As quickly and quietly as a deer, I ran towards him with a shovel above my head. As soon as I came within striking distance, I slammed the shovel down on his head. The man stumbled back and clutched his head. I raised it to strike again, but he scrambled out of reach. I yelled as loud as my voice could go. I kept yelling. Behind me, the lights to my parents' room snapped on. So did the neighbors. All of them, I think. The man got up, dropped his knife, and ran, hitting the gate and stumbling as he ran away. My parents came rushing out, and I dropped into their arms in tears. I never hugged them tighter in my life. The police came and took a report, roped off the scene, and took evidence. I learned later that a few people had been stabbed to death a few towns over, and this was probably the same person. It didn't make me feel any better. Nothing ever came from the police report. They never found the guy. My parents installed security cameras, and our camping trips dropped down to 0. I've had a lot of counselling over the years, and I've even gone camping from time to time. Never managed to do any off-the-grid camping. I had a strange request from my parents. I wanted his knife. I knew it was evidence, and I might not ever get to see it, but I had to ask. The police said they needed to hold on to it, but about 5 years later, they closed the case and gave it to me. I have it still, a memento of the bravest thing I've ever done. I've moved on from that town and tried to leave everything in the past. Every once in a while, I get a tickle down to my spine, like someone is watching me. It's probably PTSD, but I sometimes wonder. I always look for footprints in the soil outside my house. So far, I haven't seen any. But last night, when I let my dog out into the backyard, I swear I heard someone jump over my fence. Make yourself comfortable and help yourself to anything in the fridge, but probably best not to go upstairs. Grandma's asleep up there, and she hasn't been well lately. Those were the last words my girlfriend said to me before she left me alone in her mum's place. Mel kissed me on the lips and winked, heading out the front door with her mother by her side, laughing as they walked towards the 2-seater Porsche in the driveway. That was the reason I wasn't invited on their little excursion to get food from the shops, apparently. Not enough car room. I didn't mind, not one bit. As I waved them off from the lounge window, the main thing I felt was relief. Half an hour alone would allow me to calm down a bit and recover my nerves before dinner. You know that feeling you get when you meet a new partner's parents for the first time? Those horrible, stomach-churning nerves, the desire to make a good impression. Well, times all that by 100. That was how I felt when Mel and I pulled up in her mum's driveway. Partly, it was the strength of my feelings for Mel. I've only known her for a few months, but I've already convinced myself she's the one. But the other part of it was her family, her family's house. Mel comes from old money. I'm not talking middle class, 2 cars and 4 bedrooms type deal either. I mean, they're rich. Their house is a mansion. It's way out in the New Forest, set back from this little country lane. Long driveway, black iron gates, statues out the front. The whole works. Intimidating as hell, in other words. Mel's mum is intimidating too. She looks like a star from an old Hollywood film. Tall, beautiful, long black hair, green eyes that I could hardly meet when Mel introduced us. All these thoughts and memories flashed through my head as I watched the Porsche disappearing down the driveway. My heart was still beating fast in my chest, and my palms were sweaty, but I was starting to get to grips with myself. I had half an hour by myself now at least. I was alone. Well, not completely alone. Probably best not to go upstairs. Grandma's asleep up there, and she hasn't been well lately, she said. Mel's parting words floated back to me. I stared up at the ceiling. A couple of seconds later, as if on cue, I heard the first thump. It took me a long time to make the decision to go upstairs. For at least 10 minutes, I stood in the hall of Mel's mum's house, staring up into the shadows of the first floor landing, wondering whether or not to investigate the sound I'd heard. The house around me was silent. I could hear birdsong outside, but no cars. The hum of the refrigerator drifted in from the kitchen, nothing else. I'd been standing there for about 5 minutes when the second thump came. It was up above my head, somewhere between a footstep and the thud of furniture tipping over. Shortly after that, the sound came again, even louder the third time. That was enough for me. Thinking that Mel's grandma might have fallen over or hurt herself, I hurried up into the darkness. I came to a stop on the landing. I was in a long, shadowy space with doors leading off either side, too dark to see properly. I scanned my eyes across the walls for a light switch, but couldn't find one. Fumbled my phone out of my pocket, tapped the torch function, then swept the light through the darkness. I was planning to flash it across the wall to find a switch, but I didn't get that far. The photo album stopped me. The album lay in the center of a small table opposite the staircase. It was large and black, gold lettering on the cover glinting in my phone light. I walked over to read what it said. Family Dinners. That was the title of the album. The letters were written in a fine, slanted print. The book looked old. Before I could stop myself, without really thinking about what I was doing, I reached out and opened it. Tiny faces stared back at me. I was looking down at a collection of small Polaroids, loosely arranged across the cream pages. My eyes went from the one on the top left first, and I quickly understood the reason behind the album's name. The photo had been taken at dinner. Candles, glasses and wine bottles covered a long table surface. 4 people stared back at the camera. I recognized Mel and her mother right away. My girlfriend looked younger, but not by much. Her hair was a little different, but otherwise, she was pretty much the same. Mel's mother, who sat opposite her, looked about the same too. The third woman was the grandmother. Had to be. She was propped awkwardly at the table's far end, an old lady with a perm and drooping skin, thick grey bags under her eyes, hands like wrinkled claws on the tablecloth. Looking at that photo, I wasn't surprised Mel had described her as unwell. I only looked at her for a moment, though, before my eyes were drawn to the fourth face on the photo. The face of the guy sitting next to Mel. The stranger was young, blonde and handsome. He stared back at the camera with a wide grin on his face. His left hand was resting on Mel's thigh. An old boyfriend. Ignoring a twinge of jealousy in my stomach, I turned my attention to the album's next photo, and I frowned. At first, I thought it was the same group. There was Mel, with her mother sitting opposite. There was Grandma, hunched and withered at the table's far end. There was the blonde guy sitting next to Mel, his arms casually thrown around her shoulders. Only, when I looked closer, I realized that wasn't quite right. It wasn't the same guy. I looked back at the previous photo to check, comparing the two. Nope. Definitely someone new. A different boyfriend, perhaps. I turned the page. More Polaroid photos, more shots around the dining table, more men. Each photo was exactly the same setup, with just a different guy. There were 4 new ones on this page. A tall redhead with freckles and long arms, a well-muscled rugby player type, another blonde guy, a nervous-looking, slightly overweight bloke with red cheeks. My eyes flicked between each of them, my frown deepening. What the hell was this? I picked the album up to get a closer look, squinting down at the strangers. Mel and I hadn't ever spoken about previous relationships. I'd asked her casually once or twice, but each time she'd changed the subject. Now, I thought I could see why. I stared at her smiling face in each of the photos, feeling the jealousy in my stomach grow like weeds. "What are you doing, boy?" The voice came from the shadows behind me. I dropped the photo album. It crashed back down on the table as I spun around, my heart squeezing itself up into my throat. Mel's grandmother stood a few feet away from me. She was half hidden in the darkness, swaying in place on a metal crutch. She looked even older than she had in the photos. Almost ancient. Thin white hair covered her scalp. Her eyes glinted in the darkness of the hallway, tiny beads buried in loose folds of flesh. When she opened her mouth, I could just make out the browning stumps of her teeth. "You shouldn't be up here." "I'm sorry. I heard a noise and thought I'd come up quickly and check. I didn't mean to." "You shouldn't be up here." Her sudden scream caught me completely off guard. I panicked, began backing away down the hall even as the old woman advanced towards me, shuffling across the carpet far more quickly than I'd have thought possible. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to startle you. Is it dinner time yet? Has my daughter made the preparations?" Spittle flew from her mouth as she screamed. Her hand was a white claw and a metal crutch. As she continued hobbling towards me, I spotted a half-open door on my left. A bathroom. Before I could think about what I was doing or why, I darted inside, shut the door behind me, and pulled the bolt. A split second later, the handle began to rattle. "Is it dinner time? I'm so hungry, Clarissa." I backed away from the door, my heart pounding hard. I kept telling myself she was just an ill old lady, probably sufferer of dementia or something similar, but the thought did nothing to ease the thumping in my chest. All that happened half an hour ago. I texted Mel 25 minutes back to tell her exactly what happened. She sent a response back straight away. "Oh God, I'm so sorry. Don't move. We'll be back ASAP. X." I followed her instructions. I was still pretty unsettled after the encounter with her grandma, but Mel's text message helped me calm a little. It helped relax me. Or at least, it did at first. Over the past 20 minutes or so, though, I've started feeling worse again. I've started feeling nervous, unsettled in a way I can't quite place. Partly, it's that photo album. My mind keeps going back to it, picturing all those faces, all those men. The thing is, I almost feel like I recognize one of them. That first blonde guy. I feel like I've seen his face somewhere before. At first, I thought he must just be someone I knew from uni or school, maybe even someone I'd seen around town. That's not right, though. I know it isn't right. When I picture his face, I feel like I've seen it on social media. A photo being shared around on Twitter or something. Either that or in a newspaper. That's not the thing making me feel nervous, though. The main thing is Mel's grandma. She's still there, outside the door. I can hear her breathing even as I type this, shuffling back and forth in the hallway, occasionally muttering to herself. Mostly it's nonsense or stuff I can't quite hear, but a couple of times I've made out the words. A few stray sentences here and there. About 10 minutes ago, for instance, she whispered something about fear making them tender. Whatever the hell that means. Mostly, she just keeps saying how hungry she is and asking if dinner's ready. But I need to go now anyway. I just heard the Porsche coming down the driveway. It's funny, but even though I know the sound should make me feel better, it doesn't. The nerves in my stomach, that bad, hard-to-place feeling, just won't go. I have a view of the driveway through the bathroom window. Looking out of it now, I can see the car pulling up. I can see Mel and her mother getting out. I'd have thought they'd have been worried after that text I sent, but they're both still laughing like they did when they left. And the thing that's even stranger, even though they told me they were getting stuff for dinner, the only thing they're carrying in their hands is red wine. no sign of food at all. I once had a film professor tell our class that making horror movies was like the old Western prospectors that would pan for gold. He queued up a clip from some black and white cowboy movie that showed a skinny, raw-boned, shrunken little monkey of a man in overalls and a flipped brim hat tugging a mule up to the edge of a river before getting out his metal pan. He'd said, with a derisive sniff, that people made horror movies because they were cheap to make, expectations were low, and if you hit it big, well, they were very profitable. The reality, of course, was that most never found more than a few gold flakes. His point was to convince us that horror was a creatively bankrupt and shallow genre, and that wasting time on it was a fool's errand. What he actually accomplished, at least as me and my friends in the class were concerned, was simply to reconfirm our opinion that he was an out-of-touch, pompous ass. Horror movies could be made cheaply, that's true. And depending on the script and the crew's ability to do less with more, you could make a really cool movie for a fraction of the cost of, say, fantasy or period drama. But besides all that, there was one simple fact that caused our little filmmaking group to make our first post-graduation project a scary movie. Because horror is badass. We threw around different ideas for weeks. Production needed to be aggressively economical. We didn't want to do any of the tired subgenres without a fresh approach, and we had none. So, no demonic possession, no film crews as characters inexplicably trapped in the woods, and no damn haunted houses. Initially, we were going to avoid using the found footage format entirely, but look, it's just a lot cheaper and easier for some things. You still have to do your best, of course, but if there's a rough edge here or there, well, audiences are a lot more forgiving of sloppy camera work and bad lighting when you're a found footage film. And we had a decently cool idea that seemed like it might actually work. The cursed film genre isn't anything new, right? Aside from the big ones like The Ring, you've got more and more smaller films popping up all the time. There are found footage, some are mockumentaries, and some are just, well, they're more experimental. I had gone with Jacob, our group's unofficial leader and director, to a couple of underground film festivals and seen some pretty weird stuff. He'd agreed with me that he didn't want to get too extreme. The film needed to be marketable and have a chance at film festivals that didn't take place in an abandoned bottling plant, but he did think he had a neat twist. We'd make a found footage movie about making a found footage movie. Okay, pretty standard stuff so far. I've seen dozens of these, the crew is the victim kind of things, and they usually leave me pretty cold. Maybe it's just because I'm in the business, but I actually find their acting and their work on the film they're supposedly making pretty inauthentic, and it just takes me out of it. And I get it, you've got to work with what you've got. You're not going to get the best actors in every role, but still, we were supposed to be moving away from cliché, not running into its arms. But wait, he said, there's more. The cast, which would also be most of the crew, would only be aware of the surface plotline. They'd all think we're making a found footage / cursed movie about a film crew that runs afoul of whatever, an evil skinwalker or the reincarnated soul of a serial killer. They'd have scenes where they filmed the movie, and they'd have scenes where they were picked off one by one. What they wouldn't realize is that there was a third layer, a deeper story. Below the movie they were making and the movie they thought they were starring in, one where they got picked off for real. Our sound editor, Katie, she gets snatched in the parking lot after a midnight shoot. The writers, Paul and Sarah, they'd get taken in their apartments, and then a cryptic video of their abduction would be sent to me. Jacob said it would be part of his third, realer story that I'd show the video to him and we'd agree it was just them throwing a weird tantrum because of some of the changes he was making to the script. I'd be next to go, followed by a cameraman, Brad. At the end, only Jacob would be left. We were drinking when Jacob told me his ideas, but the intensity in which he was telling me all this cut through most of the alcohol. He wasn't kidding. And yeah, it was an interesting idea, but are you talking about really hurting them or something? I shouldn't have had to ask the question, and I should have known that something was deeply wrong that I felt I needed to. I'd known Jacob for nearly 3 years, and while he could be very arrogant and hard to deal with at times, he wasn't a bad guy. I'd never seen him do anything violent or physically dangerous to anyone. But at the same time, I considered him my friend. But I didn't trust him. He had a hardness underneath his big ideas and driven enthusiasm that, well, it made me question exactly how far he was willing to go. My stomach knotted as I said the words, and I felt a rush of relief as his eyes widened in shock. What? Jesus, of course not. Damn, I'm not that crazy. I gave a sigh of relief. Yeah, I know, but how would that work? How are we going to make them all disappear if they aren't in on the joke? I mean, we could just tell them as it comes, but it's kind of lame if we're having a series of conversations about, gosh, I wonder where Katie went, and there's no action. He grinned, his eyes taking on that hard twinkle I didn't like. Oh, we'll have footage, plenty of it. Look, here's the deal. I've gotten us some backing. Not just money, but a couple of guys that are trained professionals. They're the real deal. They do bodyguard jobs, hostage rescues, the whole thing. These are the types some rich guy hires when his kid gets snatched during spring break. I tried to break in, but he just looked away and kept going. Anyway, this Asian company my dad did a lot of business with, they have a small film division. They don't want to come into the project as a full producer or anything, but they are willing to invest some cash and a couple of their top security guys to do the extra scenes. My stomach began to twist into another knot. You're joking again, right? Jacob frowned. No, this is awesome. Why would I be joking? It's not like they're going to get hurt. They're just going to be taken and secured in a location long enough for me to explain what's going on. No big deal. I sat back in my chair. No big deal? They'll be terrified. Some strange dudes grabbing them and carrying them off somewhere. And you'll have them in some costume or something, right? What if they fall or run into traffic, or what if one of them has a gun? I don't know that Katie or Paul does, but I'm pretty sure Brad goes deer hunting and Sarah gets panic attacks and... He raised his hands. Slow your roll, man. These are professionals. They're going to get them in safe spots. They pick the time and the place. The only rules they have is that they cannot hurt them or let them get hurt, and they have to keep their body cams rolling until I say cut. But even if that's true, it's still a dirty trick to play on your friends. They'll hate us, maybe sue us, and they sure as hell won't finish working on the film. Jacob grinned. Won't they? See, the money I'm getting from the investors, it's not going into shooting it. That's already covered well enough. Instead, it's going into a $25,000 completion bonus for each of us. When we get taken, safely taken, I'll immediately go to them and tell them what's up, that we wanted their real reaction, their raw emotion, that everything is fine, that they just need to stay in the nice hotel room they've been given for a couple of weeks while we wrap up principal. After that, they go back to whatever work they have left on the film, and when it's all done, if they stuck it out, they get $25,000. Let's see if any of them hate me then. He studied my silent stare for a moment before pressing on. Besides, when we get to looking for a distributor, think of all the press we can generate. Interviews, whole articles about how the movie was made. We'll be horror rock stars before we're done. I shrugged. My head was aching, and I didn't know what to do. It was a lot of money, and we could all use it. And as pushy as Jacob could be, he was also very competent and professional when it came to work. If he said it was safe and legit, it probably was. Look, we have to be really careful with this, okay? These are real people, not characters in a movie, and they're our friends. If either of us decide to pull the plug, or if any of them aren't cool once you explain everything, we stop, okay? Jacob's eyes lit up as he nodded. Of course. I wouldn't have it any other way. We started filming the next week. My primary roles were assistant director and editor, and I spent my time between being on set and reviewing the prior dailies. Everything was going just okay. The surface story was pretty bland, but we had good luck with locations and the weather had cooperated so far. Everyone's acting was, well, it was passable. But everyone was too stiff and self-aware. Maybe it was because I was watching and re-watching the footage, but it became increasingly clear that there was no real danger, no real stakes. Just amateur filmmakers playing at being amateur actors. That's when Katie went missing. Jacob had told me he wouldn't tell me exactly what was going to happen and when, so it would be easier for me to hide what I knew to the others. I'd been expecting her to go early, but not quite so fast. Brad or I could cover basic sound capture, but it wouldn't be anywhere near as good as what she could do. Still, when she didn't show up or answer her phone, I guessed that Jacob's secret third movie had started. Everyone was worried about Katie at first, but when we got a mass text from her number saying she'd had to fly out to be with her mother in Colorado, emergency surgery or something, it was easy enough to fake. But no one was suspicious at that point. The next ones to go was supposed to be Paul and Sarah, but it wasn't. It was Brad. He'd been on a lunch break that he never came back from. We were shooting at a rest stop at the time, so there weren't a lot of places to look. But there was no sign of him after all. No answer from his phone either. Brad had ridden out with Jacob that day, so his car wasn't left behind. But when Sarah went by his house the next day, it was sitting in his driveway. No sign of Brad though, and she couldn't get anyone to the door when she knocked, despite the fact that it was early in the morning and he lived with his girlfriend. It was at this point I started getting really worried. Jacob had said that we needed to keep radio silence about the secret movie while we were filming to avoid any slip-ups or arousing the other's suspicion. After each abduction, he told me he'd just text me their name and a thumbs up emoji after he had talked to them and everything was cool. He'd done it for Katie an hour after we broke for the night. He did it for Brad the evening after we spent hours searching for him around the rest stop. Jacob filming all the time. I didn't have any reason to think he was lying, but I also couldn't be sure he wasn't. What if they had gotten hurt? What if they were super mad and wouldn't agree to anything? Would he force them to stay somewhere anyway, just to keep the movie going? I didn't think so. But by the third day after Brad's disappearance, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to talk to him. Talk to them. When I approached Jacob about it, he just glared at me. You know that's not possible. We have to keep this ship tight. We've already wasted half this week pepping up Paul and Sarah just to keep them going. I need their last 3 scenes done before we can move on to you and then the finale. I frowned. And that's another thing. Why did you do them out of order? Brad was supposed to be the last except for me. As it is, I'm having to do video, audio, and editing now. He snorted. Brad's camera work sucks, so that'll be an improvement. And I have to mix it up so you look tense too. Not being mean, but your acting is balls. But since Brad, you've gotten a lot more organic. A lot more real. All of you have." He wasn't wrong. There'd been a palpable tension since Katie's disappearance, and it had only grown with Brad missing. It was all starting to feel like something powerful, unique, and that was exciting, especially if we could keep the wheels from coming off before we were done. Still, the gnawing in my belly demanded I try one more time. "Can you have them call me at least? Let me see how they're doing." Jacob raised an eyebrow. "I told you they were all fine. Thumbs up, remember? If you don't trust me, then you're free to quit the film. I'm sure everybody will be happy to split up your share of, well, everything that's going to come from this." He stopped and just stared at me until I dropped my eyes and shrugged. "Okay then, let's get back out there while we still have some light left." 4 days later, I was standing outside of Paul and Sarah's apartment building. The 6th through the 8th floor was engulfed in flames, and I knew from experience that their home was on the 7th. Jacob was beside me, screaming and crying, shouting to the firemen to please save his friends. Maybe to a passerby, it would have seemed genuine. Jacob's a much better actor than I am. When he turned to look at me, his face a drawn O of despair, I saw that same glinting hardness in his eyes that I've always feared deep down because I didn't understand it. Now, I was beginning to. It was the gleam of unrelenting, terrible will that could shed mercy and morality when it suited. It was a cold and reptilian drive that said that nothing mattered but the chase and the kill and the feed. I just thought he was driven, but Jacob was far more than that. He was a monster. And as I recoiled in horror from him, from what he had done, his expression didn't change. His eyes didn't alter. The only reaction he had to my stepping away was the subtly tug at the place that the body cam nestled on his shirt. Apparently, I'd stepped out of frame. I'm writing this now, months after Katie and Brad went missing and Paul and Sarah's bodies were found, melted together in their bathroom. I didn't write this before, tell anyone about this before, because I'm a coward. After the day of the fire, I drove home, packed up my stuff, and went to the other side of the country. Aside from emailing my parents periodically, I haven't had contact with anyone from my old life. My hope was that, if I stayed quiet and out of the way, Jacob would just leave me alone, that he'd likely be unable to find me given the steps I'd taken to secure anonymity. But even if he did, he would see that it wasn't worth the risk and exposure to come after me now. That's the very argument I made when he called me this morning. I told him I had a detailed account of what had happened written and ready to be sent to the authorities if I went missing or turned up dead. That I didn't want any trouble, and I knew I was implicated in some of it, but if he started coming around, he'd leave me no choice but to expose both of us. He'd listened to my rambling threats patiently, and when I was done, he just gave a short, hard laugh. "That's okay, kid. You tell whoever you want. Like they say, there's no such thing as bad publicity." "But I'm out. Just leave me out. It's over with. Done." His voice was rougher now. Any trace of humor gone. "Nothing is over until the film is finished." "Then let me stay on and help you. We can finish it together." Jacob paused a moment, as though considering the offer, before responding. I appreciate the thought, but it just won't work. Your contribution to the film is meant to be on screen this time. And besides, you know my rule. What rule? The director always gets the final cut. I'll be seeing you. It seemed like the best option at the time. In my defense, I wasn't exactly thinking clearly. Neither did I have much time to consider other alternatives. It was either lose the hand or suffer some fate so horrible that the loss of a hand seems almost trivial by comparison. The events leading up to my self-severance are, as you can expect, rather terrible. Why else would someone mutilate themselves? I was with friends, hanging out at what I guess you can call an abandoned building, or yet to be finished one, depending on how you looked at it. It was some sort of dormitory or loft, something smaller than an apartment, and, from the sign that had been out in front, meant for a classier standard of living than other housing in the area. The project had been started a year prior to the trespassing, which led to my dismemberment, and then abandoned a few months in. Apparently, some girl and her boyfriend had ventured there one night to hook up, and an unsecured beam above them had fallen, impaling them both. They were found like that, speared through their chests, embraced in wide-eyed shock at the disruption of their amorous activity. You'd think this incident of extreme mortal misfortune would deter others from trespassing on the property, if not already deterred by the various signs which threatened fines and arrests. Well, if that were the case, I wouldn't be here, telling you about how I had to cut off my hand with a box cutter, would I? My friends and I would often sneak onto the property, unwatched as it were, and hang out beneath its barely finished skeleton, chatting, drinking, planning out our nights, which inevitably found us exploring some other property we probably shouldn't have been at. In our defense, the city, the contractor, or whomever was in charge of the place should have just torn it all down. We were a small town, underdeveloped, with nothing but the internet to hold the attention of our youth. What were they expecting? The site had become a veritable town attraction for us teenagers. Stay a while at the unfinished loft, where the lovers met their end. Are you brave enough to lie at the same spot where the wood pierced their chests? In a rather unusual turn of events for my particular friend group, the abandoned/unfinished building became the final destination of our night's rounds. We had visited several fast food restaurants, buying the cheapest snacks at each, only as justification to linger and flirt with the cute cashiers. My older brother, Nate, who was 19 but could pass for 21 if you hadn't asked him to talk, had bought us some beer from the gas station a bit out of town. There, a place often frequented by truckers, was the preferred spot of booze acquisition for us teens, because the seemingly sole attendant was what you'd call a profiteer. That is, he accepted tips, bribes, cash on top, whatever you want to call it. $5 in addition to the price of whatever you bought. Bellies full and beer in hand, we offloaded ourselves from my friend Austin's truck and settled into the overly ventilated husk of that accursed building. It was, at least meant to be, fairly spacious. Several rooms had been planned, the dimensions either established by the still-standing woodwork or marked in some way on the concrete flooring. Sheets of plastic stapled to window frames or between columns were presumably meant to spare the interior from the elements. All the workmen's tools had been collected, although you could occasionally find a nail or two on the floor, as if they sprang up from between the unsealed cracks or fell from the structure. There were 4 of us there that night. Myself, Austin, Luke, and Ronnie. My brother, after getting us the booze, went back home to rest. Despite having bought alcohol for minors, he was still somewhat of a responsible adult and had to work the following morning. I'm glad for that, because had he been with us, he would have most likely died, along with my friends. Yes, I was the only survivor of that awful night. We spent the first half hour goofing around, talking about our lives, drinking, treating the haphazard construction as if it were a jungle gym, really pushing the bacterial resistance imparted to us by our tetanus shots. When that became boring, well, when we became drunk enough for such behaviour to be far too perilous, we sat on the bare concrete and fired up some music. The building was in a conveniently desolate location, the general idea of planning being that businesses would arise around it once it was finished. Or, that's what we all had guessed at least. Regardless of the reason, we could play our music as loud as we wanted and laugh and shout and make fools of ourselves despite the time. Luke, the funniest member of our gang, was doing imitations of teachers. We were teenagers, you must remember, while Ronnie and I egged him on, in typical improv fashion. Austin, our ever-paranoid de facto guard, kept half his attention on us and the other half on his truck. He wasn't afraid of it being discovered by patrolling authorities, but being tampered with by skulking vagabonds, or what he called degenerates. Due to the relative vacancy of the area compared to others of our town, people of sordid habits were often spotted hanging around here, although none of them ever went to that particular property, with it being so open to view. Their activities required a much greater degree of concealment. At some point, I had to go to the bathroom, which only meant stepping outside of immediate view and relieving myself in what I'll call a pit. Its original purpose totally unidentifiable. Moments later, I was making my way back to the room where we were hanging out, when I decided to check out the spot where the two people had died a few months back. To my disappointment, the spot was unremarkable, having nothing to indicate that anyone had perished there. It's morbid to want some sort of excitement from that, I know, but I was a dumb, thrill-seeking kid. I self-prescribed the challenge and laid down at the spot beneath the half-constructed ceiling from which the lethally loose beam had fallen. The sky, plainly visible through the large square where the roofing would have eventually been put up, yawned on starlessly, coming across as both relaxing and ominously unnerving. The moon shone overhead, eerily spotlighting my position. I lay there for about 45 seconds, waiting, though not really expecting, for something to happen. I got up and left the room, hoping that the guys had found something of interest to do, or at least talk about. When I entered and sat down as Luke and Ronnie were discussing about girls they found attractive, both being what you'd politely call eccentric, were discussing fictional women, those of video games and anime. I was about to join in and offer the definitive best girl from each medium of entertainment when Austin suddenly spoke up. "Dude, doesn't that hurt?" I turned to him, and then to Ronnie and Luke, assuming he had been referring to one of them. But they both looked at me, their eyes venturing to my left. Turning, I saw a splinter, a pretty large one, had been embedded into the wrist of my left arm at some point. I didn't remember it being there before, and hadn't felt anything which would have signified its insertion. The only guess that came to mind was that I'd unwittingly picked it up when lying on the floor in the death room. With genuine surprise, I remarked that I hadn't noticed it, and plucked it out quickly. Luke immediately suggested that I was lying, that I had noticed it, or I'd even put it there and wanted to appear badass. Ronnie chimed in with a similar accusation, and I stuttered out a denial to their claims. Austin was the only one who hadn't viewed the situation as humorous, and looked at the splinter as if it was some extremely inimical thing. I plucked the splinter from my wrist and flicked it at Luke, who graciously dodged it, falling into Ronnie as he did so. "You alright? Want to grab some antiseptic or something?" Austin's voice was oddly serious, at least in comparison to our buzz-slurring and casual demeanours. Even though the hangout had grown a bit boring, I didn't want the party to disband just because of a splinter, and even if the threat of infection seemed rather likely, considering its inordinate size, I dismissed his offer, and he nodded in response and turned away, resuming his position as our sentinel. The night went on, and a strange feeling gradually overcame me. It first began as a sensation of warmth, as you can expect, was first localized in my lower left arm. As the minutes ticked by, and the constitution of my blood became greater parts alcohol, I started feeling truly sick. I had initially attributed the warmth to the beer, but as time progressed, it became discernibly clear that it was a different kind of warmth, a hotter, heavier warmth, as if my blood had become molten, as if the air in my lungs had been replaced by the coarse spewed gases of some deep earth mine. My friends had apparently noticed the shift in my composure, despite my attempts to appear well. Luke, taking a breath from his humour, asked if I was alright, and if I wanted to call his mom, who was an RN. Again, not wanting to spoil the night, despite feeling like absolute garbage, I dismissed the idea, and pantomimed dialing a phone with my left hand. "I'll call your mom, but it won't be about the splinter." As I've stated already, we were teenagers. My delivery was rather sluggish, and elicited only an unsteady laugh from Luke and Ronnie. Austin, not needing to be told something twice, hadn't bothered checking on me a second time, although I could tell by the tilt of his head that he was at least partially observant of my state. "Cameron, is that you?" The voice not only cut short the meek laughter, but also seemed to silence the ambience of the night. I first looked at Luke, expecting to see him holding a phone, but his hands were flat on the concrete as he leaned back on them. Ronnie was twiddling a bottle cap, and Austin had folded his arms across his chest. The voice spoke again, coming from my hand, still held to my ear in the imitation of a phone. "Cameron, what's wrong, hun? Where's Luke?" I felt ill, and not just from the effects of the splinter, but from the wrongness, the impossibility of what was happening. No one asked how I was doing it, or told me to knock it off. It was undeniable that we heard the voice of Luke's mother, speaking aloud through my hand. We sat there, staring at it. Even I did, as if it was something which shouldn't have been attached to my arm. "Mom? Is that you?" Luke's voice came out softly, as if he had regressed several years in age. "Yes, honey. Are you doing alright? How late will you be out?" Luke's mother said, completely oblivious to the manner in which we were communicating. Dumbfounded, not knowing what else to do, I outstretched my hand to Luke, still in that gesture which mimicked the rough structure of a phone. He leaned in, warily eyeing my hand, and spoke. "I'm alright, Mom. Just hanging out with the guys. I'll be home in a bit." His mother said okay, told him to be safe, and that there would be a plate of spaghetti waiting for him in the microwave. I pulled my hand back, and in a moment of preternatural instinct, balled it into a fist, and, as I had dimly suspected, the call was ended. There was a faint click, signifying the end of the connection. We sat, silently, staring at my hand for what felt like an hour, but what realistically could have been only a few moments. Everyone had heard the call, and, being the seasoned, underage drinkers, we knew that it could not have been the alcohol playing some collective trick on our minds. It was no shared hallucination brought on by lingering paint fumes or some residual dust. We just had a conversation with Luke's mom through my hand. "Dude, what the hell was that?" Ronnie exclaimed. We all, in turn, expressed similar sentiments of confusion, and I distanced my hand from myself as if it were gangrenous. The warmth which had swelled within me had subsided during the call, and the hand felt no different than any other part of my body. At first, I'm sure we had all felt, but would never admit to, what was essentially fear. But this quickly transformed into curiosity, a desire to test the limits of my newly acquired communicative powers. But first, Luke and Ronnie had of course tried to use their own hands to place calls, neither which had any success. Austin hadn't bothered trying and proffered the suggestion that my ability to do so was directly tied to the splinter which had lodged itself in the same arm. This explanation, as ridiculous as it seemed, was the only one we had, and so we accepted it as the reason. The first test, suggested by Luke, was to call his phone, which he retrieved from his pocket and placed on the floor, as if it was some totem awaiting magical enchantment. I again performed the gesture, but stopped short, ignorant as to how I would actually dial. Ronnie said that maybe it was just mental, that all I had to do was say or think the name of the person, since that's what I had done with Luke's mom. I tried this, thinking of Luke's phone, or rather his phone number. And sure enough, his phone started ringing as soon as I put my hand to my ear. We tried this with everyone's phone, including mine, and each time I was able to supernaturally connect with the devices. The number listed across the screens was unavailable. Attempts to call the number back were totally unsuccessful. But eventually, someone did call my hand. The call came as I was preparing to dial beyond our group, namely my brother, probably fast asleep by then. I had just brought the hand to my ear when it vibrated. Autonomously, the sensation unfelt by the rest of my body. Coinciding with this abnormal vibration was a pain not unlike the warmth I had felt earlier. It was hot and grew hotter with every second that passed, until it became an agony that banished all other sense impressions from my mind. I couldn't see, hear, taste, nor smell anything. I could only feel that white-hot, searing heat surge beneath my palms, shoot through the lengths of my fingers, radiate from my joints. Luckily, some instinct granted to me by the phenomenon compelled me to form my hand into that mimicry of a phone, and upon doing so, the heat and pain overload subsided. Not a second later, I heard a voice emit from the hand. I had answered a call. I will be built. I will not be desecrated. You will take up the task, or you will fall to ruin, just as I have. The voice was plainly inhuman, and even stranger, sounded like something not alive at all, not in the way we categorize life, but animated in some supernatural artificial way. It spoke laboriously, as if unfamiliar with the language through which it had chosen to communicate. If rocks could breathe, was what eerily came later in the night as I recounted the events. The speaker did not wait for a response, and a tingling sensation in my hand, not painful at all, seemed to signify that the call had been ended by the other party. We should leave. Those were Austin's words, which at the moment sounded as if there'd been some deeply profound, revelatory sermon. We all immediately arose, and I shoved my hand into my pocket, hoping no one else would call and bring about that awful pain. Ronnie, always quick on his feet, was the first to leap through the threshold of our particular room and make his way to the outer area of the lot. He had nearly reached the area designated as the front lawn when a column of wood fell over, momentarily barring his passage. Shaken but undeterred, he went to step around it, but was stopped by something which pinned the cuff of his pant leg to the ground. Looking down, he saw a nail implanted through the fabric into the concrete. Having followed him, we all saw the restraining nail and simultaneously advised him to yank it out, each of us sensing that its appearance was in some way related to the freaky call I've received. Kneeling down, Ronnie went to work dislodging the nail. I think if we'd been a bit more sober, or had just generally been more impressionable to the sinister mood of the situation, we would have urged him to pull his leg away, to rip the pant leg so that we could get out of there. But we hadn't, and we waited. If only we had the sense to be more afraid. It was then that the skeletal framework of the building started to shift, transforming into a structure of such geometric complexity that I could only vaguely describe its makeup as being alien, totally unlike any building or piece of abstract art I'd ever seen. My friends were dumbstruck by the impossibly animate material, and we resembled pitiful woodland creatures moments before being obliterated by a speeding car. Ronnie swore relentlessly and started tugging frantically at the unyielding nail. Luke, afraid to move, merely babbled on about how not right things were. Austin was quiet, from either terror or amazement. It was honestly hard to tell. As the structure took on stranger and stranger dimensions, and the sky above became occluded by the transformation, Ronnie finally removed the nail from the concrete. He rejoiced, tossed it aside, and was about to exit the diminishing entryway a few feet ahead of him, when a soft thud was somehow heard above the groaning of the wood. He froze, and despite the terror manifesting around us, we focused on our friend. He turned to us, his face twisted into an expression of both pain and confusion. In his chest, directly at the spot of his heart, was the head of the nail, the rest embedded within his flesh. He was dead before he hit the ground. The rest of us, understandably, went into full-blown panic. Luke ran deeper into the contorting building, although I wasn't sure if he was even aware of doing so. His mind had programmed him to flee, regardless of the flight's direction. Austin, usually the most level-headed of us, stood petrified, his eyes darting around as if searching for some spot of normalcy among the increasingly non-Euclidean geometry. Unseen by searching eyes, a plank, sharpened to a deadly point, shot down from the archway under which he stood, slicing him down the middle. The two sides of his body parted gruesomely, falling away to the floor and landing loudly, disgustingly. It was then that I ran. I bounded over slabs of concrete, weaved through and ducked beneath barriers and unconnecting ducts, smashed through drywall like some raging bull, and tore through layer after layer of insulation. But still, despite my efforts and progress, the building shifted, making any distance I traversed seem infinitesimal. Eventually, after pushing on until my lungs burned nearly as much as my hand had, I stumbled into a room which had yet to undergo the more bizarre transformations taken on by the former rooms. It was here that I found Luke, kneeled over and wheezing, his body riddled with nails. Unlike Ronnie, Luke had been spared, if you can call it that, the piercing of a vital organ. The nails seemed to have been inserted with surgical precision as to keep him debilitated, but alive. Before I could go to him and offer what help I could, my hand was again stricken with that infernal pain, and, without prolonging the torture, I answered the call in the way I now knew how. You will be the builder. You will see to my completion, or he will die. The call was ended as abruptly as the last one. Luke, having heard it, groaned and murmured something unintelligible. I looked around, hoping to find something with which to cover the wounds made by the nails once I started pulling them out. But all I saw was wood, concrete, plaster, and dust. And all of it without any discernible design, shifting and expanding. I went to Luke, knelt beside him, and asked if he could stand. He grabbed me and pulled me close, but instead of pleading for my help or crying out in pain, he whispered the phrase, "You have to go." While I was more than fine with leaving the structure, if I could manage to, I was not going to leave him behind, not while he still breathed. I had watched the others die, and had no intention of rescuing their bodies from whatever grimly sepulchral fate awaited them within this enigmatic building. The noise of splintering wood overhead briefly drew my attention away from my nail-peppered friend, and I saw above me a mounting pinnacle, like some magically reared spire rising to blot out the moon so as to conceal the work of devilry. This palatial growth comprised of concrete shelled wood, and from the protruded, sharpened rebar at intervals seemed to possess a vague intelligence or life, as if it were the brain, heart, or some warped nucleus of the whole abysmal structure. It peaked at a height which towered over any other structure on the night-draped horizon, standing sinisterly erect over its ever-shifting kingdom. Nothing happened beyond its growth, so I turned back to Luke, hoping to somehow carry him out to safety. But in the brief lapse of my attention, Luke had somehow acquired a box cutter, presumably left behind months ago, and had slid its blade across his neck. Blood fell freely from the wound, pooling on the concrete beneath his head. He turned to me, wincing as he did so, and said that he would have eventually died anyway, and that he'd rather go out on his own terms. It was a surprisingly lucid, shockingly mature statement coming from him, and I could do nothing but accept his terms. There was no saving him. I thanked him for his friendship and got up to leave. Before I could run away, he grabbed my ankle and held out the box cutter, motioning for me to take it. I did, although I was unsure what he expected me to do with it, against the monstrosity of construction reforging itself around us. I pocketed the box cutter, thanked him again, and ran through an empty doorway into another section of the building. My story comes to an end here. In this room, the walls had uprighted themselves. Even the doorway through which I had arrived was immediately sealed after my passage. Before I could attempt to demolish one of the walls, my hand again burned, and I quickly answered the call before it fried my nerves altogether. You've all been overmastered. Submit, become my builder, or be entombed within my bowels. I ended the call before he could say anything else. Unfortunately, he called again, sparking that dreadful burning. I couldn't take it, knew at that moment that he would not kill me, but would continue to call until I submitted to his desires. We were the only ones who frequented this abandoned lot these days. I knew then that it couldn't wait for someone else to stumble upon its grounds. Sealed in, with nothing else happening beyond the searing pain in my hand, I convinced myself of what had to be done. I withdrew the box cutter from my pocket, leaned against the cold concrete floor, and began sawing my hand off at the wrist. Imagine the pain of having to sever your own hand. First slicing through the skin and underlying tissue, then reaching the bone, and having to saw through that. The gushing of blood, sickeningly wet, the cognitive dissonance of inflicting such pain upon yourself, your conscious mind trying to convince your brain and body that what you're commanding them to do is for their own good. Imagine all that as best you can. And still, I'm certain it won't come close to the reality of it. The room in which I was trapped had been dark, most of the light blocked by the enclosing walls, which did not alter themselves as the rest of the structure did. I was essentially blind, save for a few slivers of moonlight that breached certain cracks on the hastily constructed ceiling. The darkness was somehow settling. The inability to see the ruin of flesh at my wrist, the gathering of blood, the severed hand, not having to actually see the things, almost made them seem unreal. Until, as if to deprive me of any peace, the severed hand started glowing a hellish red. Another call coming through. I blacked out then. I first regained consciousness in the street, and from what I can remember, I was covered in debris and blood. Based on that memory, I assume I escaped that confinement through sheer will, had busted through a wall which, without proper reinforcement, must have been fairly weak. I again passed out, and the next memory began in a hospital bed, its edges overcrowded by my parents, Nate, and my younger sister. A doctor stood in the background along with a nurse, both trying to push through the wall that was my family so they could attend to and question me while I was still conscious. The questions came relentlessly, despite my oblivious debilitation, and I answered them as vaguely as I could, whilst giving an officer, who entered shortly after I awoke, the information he demanded. I told them of our hangout at the construction site and fabricated a story involving a deranged man. Everyone immediately assumed an addict who assaulted us with a box cutter. I explained that he had seized me and, for some inexplicable reason, had cut off my hand. I told them that I blacked out then and must have somehow made it here. I did not give any explanation for the state of my friends, would let them discover that themselves. My story was believed, and the officer spoke into a radio and dispatched some men and paramedics to the unfinished building site. They found the bodies of my friends amidst the ordinary, recognizable husk of that would-be building. They never found my hand. Hours passed, and I was eventually left alone for a bit while my parents retrieved some things from home. During this interim, I reflected back on the events, wondering if I could have imagined any of it. But as I recalled the terrors I had endured, remembered the vividness of those titan fawns taken on by the sentient building, I knew that it all had happened. At one point, the room felt as if it were growing hotter, and then the heat seemed to spatially diminish and localize itself to my right, specifically my right hand. The part first throbbed painlessly, then a sudden pain arrived with an infernal intensity, as if I had placed it into a fiery cauldron. Instinctively, I performed the gesture, then subsequently closed my hand into a fist, answering and immediately ending the call. It was still able to make contact with me. I still get a call every once in a while. I never answer it. I've grown somewhat accustomed to the frequently occurring pain, although I doubt it'll ever be something I can comfortably tolerate. The building site has remained untouched since then, aside from heavy fencing placed around the perimeter and the occasional police car that patrols the area. These measures were undertaken shortly after the funeral of my friends, all of whom were found in the exact states that I remember them dying. I've since moved away, gone to college, and even managed to acquire a decent prosthetic thanks to a fundraiser by my town. But now the incident, as horrific as it was, has already left this town's memory, save for the officers who are tasked with ensuring that the building site is not trespassed. I think it's for the best, not having to think about it. I looked into the history of the area and found nothing that suggested that the land had once been a native burial ground or anything else which would explain the presence I encountered there. I know that in some way, the deaths of that couple all those years ago were related to the inception of the horror. I suspected that maybe their deaths, their blood, had initiated or inspired the birth or awakening of something. A thing which, for whatever reason, sought to be built upon and lay claim to that particular plot of land. Hopefully the greed or laziness of those in charge of the property lets up and the site is bulldozed and paved over. But as it stands, unfinished, unborn, it'll only grow angrier, eviler, and someone else will probably die. Or, even worse, it'll find someone to willingly or unwillingly finish the project. I won't say where it's located, for the safety of those who would be curious, foolish enough to investigate it. I'll only say that somewhere in eastern Missouri is a derelict half-structure haunted by an eldritch presence. I dropped the dumbbell It thudded onto the basement floor carpet, just barely missing my big toe. My heart launched into my throat before a sigh of relief puffed from my mouth. My toe throbbed in a phantom pain of what could have been. I slowly turned my attention back to what had made me drop the weight in the first place. I had been in the middle of a bicep curl when I saw a strange bump in my forearm. This alone didn't bother me. I absently planned to investigate it when I finished the set. I assumed one of my arm veins was just oddly jutting out from the muscle pump. Then, the lump had skittered up my arm under the skin, and I jolted so hard the free weight had fallen from my hand. I stared at my arm, the tiny lump no bigger than a tiny pebble, now sitting much closer to my wrist than before. I was confused to say the least. I became aware of the heavy bass still pumping in my ears and yanked the buds out, eyes never leaving the lump. My mind cycled through explanations one by one, trying to come up with an answer for what I'd just seen. Of course, the first thing that came to mind was ridiculous. A mental recap of the scene in The Mummy. The guy had scarab beetles crawling under his skin, eating him alive. Lovely image to start, but I quickly shoved that away in favour of something more reasonable. The thing was tiny, not really oval or large enough to compare to a grain of rice, but large enough it stood out against the vein. I didn't feel its presence in my arm, and it made me queasy just thinking about pressing down on it. A strong sense told me not to. Maybe it was a blood clot. If it was it dangerous? My brain jumped to strokes and heart attacks, and I quickly grabbed my phone and took the stairs 2 at a time up to the main floor. I popped into the bathroom, examining my face for any signs of a stroke, breathing out slowly after seeing nothing. I glanced back to the inside of my wrist, the lump still sitting there. It hadn't moved since I was initially spooked. I stood there, debating if I should call an ambulance, eventually deciding it was far too irrational. I felt okay physically, just a little bit of a lingering burn from the curling of weight. The movement was what freaked me out, and it wasn't moving anymore. I hovered my finger over it, prepared to poke at the lump. I decided instead I would drive over to the nearest clinic and have them look at it. I didn't want to have it move somewhere I couldn't see. Call me paranoid, but I wasn't taking any chances. It was the weekend. I didn't have any plans. I could afford to wait a couple hours in a clinic to get it looked at. I tried not to get too distracted over the drive over, obsessively checking to see if it was still sitting there, just under the skin. It remained in place over the short drive, the hour wait, and the 20 minutes it took for the doctor to enter the room. I was incredibly tempted to prod at it, to prove I wasn't crazy, but I resisted. The older gentleman greeted me calmly, asking me what my issue was. I held up my arm and he came over to me, gripping my forearm gently and adjusting his glasses on his nose. His eyes narrowed in concentration, and I hovered my finger over the spot to direct his gaze. He asked me if I felt anything abnormal in that arm, a numbness, or if I could feel the object. I sheepishly told him no, and I hadn't touched it after I'd seen it move up my arm. He let out a short hum of acknowledgement, his neutral expression not giving me any hints as to whether this was normal or not. He continued his questioning after a beat. "Do you have any history of—" He poked at it as he spoke, and it startled us both when it skittered back down my arm the way it had come, stopping significantly closer to my elbow. He nearly dropped my forearm in shock, but managed to regain his composure quickly, brows furrowing. I attempted to control my racing heartbeat and the surge of adrenaline, unclenching my fist. A part of me was also relieved. I wasn't going crazy. It had moved. I was expecting to feel a hard pinch when he pressed down on it, like pushing a tiny rock into my arm, but I'd felt nothing besides the touch of the doctor's finger. "Interesting," he mumbled, his expression a mix of emotions. I believe confusion was one of them.
A blood clot isn't visible to the naked eye, and a cyst or abscess doesn't usually move. He thought for a moment before continuing. There's also no redness or irritation. It doesn't feel like a solid mass. It could potentially just be something lodged under the dermis of the skin, but it doesn't seem to be following the line of the vein. I suppose it could be inside the vein. He rattled off, then clicked his tongue lightly before moving away and releasing my arm. I could attempt to remove it myself, but I think you may need to go to urgent care for a biopsy or removal. I don't want to disturb it any further, he continued, staring back at my arm, wary. I sighed, but nodded. All right, I'll head there now. Try not to touch it, in case it moves again, he commented, lips pursed. That I wholeheartedly agreed to. It wasn't exactly what I'd planned for the day, but now that I'd seen it move twice, I had to see this through to the end. I drove myself over to the hospital, casually watching the tiny bump on my arm as I went through the same waiting process over again. This time, through the hours I waited, I could see that the thing was becoming restless. It didn't jolt around or anything drastic, but I swore it was slowly moving. 1 minute, it was closer to my elbow than I recalled, and the next, it had wiggled its way back down to the middle of my forearm. It made me uneasy, but I could still locate it every time I glanced down. So I tried to relax. I tried not to think of scarab beetles eating me from the inside out. Normal things, fine things. Finally, I was directed to a private area, and a nurse came to take my vitals. She took a brief look at my arm afterwards, and left to relay the information to the doctor. Of course, I still ended up having to repeat myself to the doctor, as she seemed a bit more skeptical. It moved, you said? She pursed her lips in absent disbelief. All right, let's take a look. I warned her to be careful, not because it would hurt me, but because when it moved quickly. She gave a soft hum of acknowledgement, fingers already at my wrist. When she prodded at it, the thing shot back towards my elbow. This time, though, it continued past, immediately skyrocketing my heart rate. Although I tried to stay still, I couldn't hold back the flinch of my arm and the clenching of my fist. Where did it go? Where did it go? I chanted, trying in vain to keep the panic out of my voice. She was staring at my bicep, wide-eyed. Well, you weren't kidding, she muttered. Don't worry, it's just up on your arm here. Try not to move, she said offhand, as she let go of my arm and whipped around towards a desk. She collected a few small tools, occasionally glancing back and squinting at my arm. She came back to the bed, eyeing my bicep. I sat with my jaw clenched, trying to steady my breathing. I didn't exactly enjoy hospitals, and having a tiny thing using my veins like its own personal rivetor wasn't exactly helping my stress. I breathed out slowly as she locked eyes with me. Because it seemed so close to the surface, I want to try and remove it, she said with an apologetic smile, adding a pregnant pause before continuing. I nodded stiffly. Unfortunately, because it moves, as you said, I can't freeze the spot where it is without pressing down, so I may have to try this without freezing. Are you okay with that? It's a small object, so I may have to make an incision. It would only be a tiny one, she continued slowly, waiting for approval. I took a slow breath in and out. I didn't like the idea of that, but I liked the idea of this thing's presence even less. All right, just get it out, I groaned. She nodded empathetically. She bracketed her fingers on my bicep around the object, being careful not to get too close or touch it. She hovered a wide needle over the small bump, taking a quiet breath in. On her exhale, she tapped the needle down in a quick motion, hitting right on the mark. Even if I could feel whatever was moving, the soft pinch of the needle in my arm overpowered it. She attempted to draw the needle, as if she were draining fluid, but nothing came up except a little blood. The bump shivered like it wanted to move, but it was evidently skewered by the needle. She pursed her lips, producing a small scalpel. "Take a deep breath in," she murmured. I clenched my eyes shut and looked away, unable to watch the next phase of her plan. I breathed in and out, my exhale shaky. I felt a tiny lash of pain in my arm. After only a moment, I heard a sharp intake of air and felt her move away. I fought the desire to look at whatever she pulled out of my arm. She sealed a small container, one of the urine jars, off to the side. I tried to keep my focus on the doctor herself instead of the container as she returned to treat my arm. Her eyes were wide, an expression mildly disbelieving. Blood was streaming slowly down my arm. She got to work, applying pressure to the wound as she met my eyes again. She attempted to smile reassuringly. It wasn't very effective. "I'm going to be honest," she began, and I focused on the pressure of her fingertips to keep myself steady. "I'm not sure what it is that I extracted from your arm, so I'm going to send it off to a lab so it can be analysed. In the meantime, I'm going to give you a slip to get some blood work done. There's a lab a few blocks away if you can get it done today. If not, do it as soon as possible." Her voice was calm and collected now, and it set me more at ease. She motioned for me to take over the pressure on my arm, and I did so obediently. I wouldn't worry too much right now. It's just best to get everything done quickly so we can get clarification on what we're dealing with. She spoke as she began cleaning up the drying blood drips down my arm. Her wry smile was more authentic this time. I believed her, and I let out a long breath, nodding along with her words. Once my arm was cleaned up, my bravery resurfaced. "Can I see it?" Her eyebrows raised slightly at the inquiry, but she nodded. "It's difficult to see with the blood, but yes." She lifted the jar and held it up to eye level. A shiver rocked through my spine, but I kept my eyes glued to it. It wasn't what I thought it would look like. My mind drifting to colourful, flesh-eating insects again, but it wasn't pleasant either. It was certainly bloody, but there was a clear shape, like a tiny larva or maggot. I swallowed heavily, forcing myself to look away. I sucked in a breath and nodded and thanked her for her help. I left the building to get my blood work done immediately. I was still wound up tight from the experience, but I let myself have one minor victory. It was gone. No more bump. Unless there are more. I immediately tried to shake that notion from my head, but it had already superglued itself to the forefront of my thoughts. I grit my teeth and tried to ignore it as I pulled into the parking lot of the lab. Having my blood taken was another tedious affair, but I got it done. Almost 6 hours later, the ordeal ripping half my day away from me, I arrived back home. The first thing I did was strip naked and examine myself through a full-length mirror. At one point, I grabbed a handheld mirror to make sure I could see any of the awkward spots on my back. It was difficult to tell, but it seemed to be free of any other tiny bumps on my body. I ran my hand over expanses of skin to see if I could catch any movement, but saw nothing. With everything seemingly normal, I was finally able to relax. I poured myself a stiff drink and settled in on the couch for the night. I must have exhausted myself from the stress of the day, as I barely remembered falling asleep in front of the TV. I woke up, disoriented, starving, and I had to pee like nobody's business. It was still dark, and the digital clock near the TV read 5 a.m. I scrubbed at my eyes and got up, walking over to the bathroom. As I was washing my hands, I looked down at my forearm, a habit formed only yesterday. There were 4 more lumps today. I yelped and slammed the tap off. As I stared, the water dripped from my hands under the sink. Two of the lumps slid their way to new positions. My skin crawled in disgust, quite literally. My mind dredged up the image of what lay beneath, servicing their way through my veins. I tried to think, my brain no longer foggy from sleep, but skewed with the shots of adrenaline currently pumping through my body. What day was it? It was 5 a.m, but I still needed to call into work before I drove myself to the ER. I hunted for my phone, finding it on the kitchen counter. I frowned. I had 10 missed calls and 3 voicemails. A number of them were from the hospital or the lab. The rest were from work or co-workers checking up on me. They said they hadn't seen or heard from me all day. I furrowed my brow, confused. I reread the timestamps on their messages and calls. Tuesday. Wasn't today Tuesday? It was only 5 a.m. I planned to call in today, knowing I'd have to take myself to the ER, but not until later on. But that meant today would be. I closed the app, glancing at the clock and calendar on my phone background. It was indeed 5 a.m. But it was Wednesday. I went to the clinic on Monday. I'd slept for well over 24 hours. A full day gone. The shock had me staring at my phone and flipping back and forth through the messages for a few minutes as I tried to wrap my head around it. How had I slept through an entire day like a rock? I listened to the voicemails, but set my phone down for a moment after I felt a small pinch on the back of my neck. A short "ow" escaped me out of reflex, and I instinctively reached back to feel what had caused it. A hard lump the size of a dime sat under the skin of my neck, and when I touched it, it skittered down the back of my spine, away from my hand. I recalled harshly, a strange mess of noises leaving my mouth as I gripped the counter, white-knuckled. I hung up my voicemail and dialed 911 immediately. I unlocked the front door and took my phone to the bathroom with me, trying to keep my voice steady on the phone. 911, what's your emergency? I recited my address and told them to send the paramedics. I set the phone on the bathroom counter as I slowly removed my shirt, staring at myself in the mirror and ignoring the muffled words of the operator on the phone. I slid myself down to the floor as I felt myself grow faint. I blacked out as I watched the dime-sized bumps skitter their way up and down my arms. I awoke in the hospital days later. I'm still allowed to use my phone, but I don't know if I'll be able to for much longer. I'm writing this down now while I'm still lucid. They say they're transferring me to a different wing of the hospital, but I saw the nurse talking to a pair of men in the cleanest black suits I've ever seen. I haven't seen my own skin in days, besides the tips of my fingers. Or at least, I think it's been days. Time has been slipping away from me. My fingers feel bruised and purple, along with the rest of my body. I'm dazed and confused, but I think they want me to be. No matter how many questions I ask the nurses, their answers are always vague and unhelpful. I'm too tired to argue with them for very long, and I think they have me on some heavy painkillers that keep me subdued. It must be something strong, and hopefully hallucinogenic, because even though my whole body is littered with bandages, I swear I keep seeing things moving underneath them. Hi, I've never made a post on here before. I wouldn't have said before all this that I was really a believer in the supernatural. In fact, I mostly came here to get a cheap thrill off spooky stories and laugh at the more ridiculous ones made up by gullible loons. Guess that's karma for you. I'm only doing this because I have no clue where else to turn. My story is absolutely off the wall insane. I don't really expect anyone to believe me. I don't know what I want. I just want to make sure that if I turn up dead tomorrow, someone out there will know about it, about what really happened to me. I'm not even sure myself, to be honest. Maybe I am going crazy. I definitely feel crazy. I've started doing things like crouching under my desk while I write and leaving little notes under the floorboard. I stole a knife from the kitchen and hid it under my pillow, just in case. I started wearing a rosary and praying before I go to bed. My internet history is a mess of occult nonsense and stuff that'll definitely have me on an FBI watch list. I have a bag packed, but I can't leave yet. I have to pick my moment. If I don't do this exactly right, I'm a goner. So anyway, my story. I'll stop stalling and try to get it down in as much detail as possible. I live in the southwest of England, in a little village in the back end of nowhere, where everyone knows everyone else. There's no way of getting in and out, except if you have a car, and I haven't got round to passing my test yet. My only access to the nearby village is via the bus, which comes about 3 times a day, if you're lucky, and whenever my parents decide to drive me, or my sister. My sister, I'll call her Abby. Abby has always been the kind of black sheep of the family. I always thought she was kind of cool, but she annoyed me too, and we got into a lot of arguments. Mostly because she had a habit of hogging all the attention by worrying mum and dad and getting into fights and stuff, while the only rebellious things I've really done is staying up all night playing League of Legends. She believed in things like legalizing weed and anarchy, always got into arguments with our parents. She was nice though, behind it all. You could tell. She would do anything for anyone if they needed a favour, and she always kept a promise no matter what. I'll just start with what I think is the beginning. It all started about 1.5 years ago. I'm certain of it. It was a weeknight and I was watching TV. Everyone else had gone to bed. I was in the front room, alone. It must have been near to midnight because I was dozing off. I was startled awake by a rapid knock at the door. This was pretty terrifying for obvious reasons, and I hesitated for a moment before getting up, but then I reasoned with myself to stop being a baby and toughen up. I tried to look outside the window, and I saw a figure standing at the door. I saw the outline of a man, kind of hunched over. There was little else I could make out, so I went to the door. He knocked again. Heart thumping, I steeled myself and opened the door just enough that I could see out, but not much more. He was a lot less scary than I'd imagined. He looked about 45, but well kept for his age. Like the lines on his face were barely there, and he was well dressed. Oddly well dressed, really, for the kind of person we usually come across in the countryside. He greeted me by name, which was weird, but he told me he was a friend of my mother's. I believed him, because my mum often had dinner parties and we had guests that I often didn't recognise and never saw again. Still, I hesitated to do anything, like open the door any further or do anything except stare at him uneasily. He pressed again, politely, asking if I'd invite him in. It was at that moment I realised that he was clutching a hand to his stomach, and he was straining to stand upright. I still didn't answer, but luckily my mum turned up behind me before I had to. She seemed just as surprised to see this random man on our doorstep, but they greeted each other like old friends. Then, when he lifted his hand to show her where he'd been apparently hit by a car, a hit and run apparently, she let him in immediately and started gushing in the way I recognised from when I came to her with an injury when I was little. I admit, I decided I didn't like him very much at that moment. You have to understand that it's a natural response when you see your mother getting all doughy-eyed over a handsome stranger. I didn't need to worry, because my dad was close behind, and soon they were ushering him upstairs and telling me to go to bed. I didn't know what else to do, so I obliged. It was a creepy situation, but I must admit, I didn't think too much of it. My parents seemed to trust him, so I did too. It was that simple. I still locked the door to my room that night. I pressed my ears up against the wall to the spare room, hearing a lot of commotion and hushed murmuring voices, but little more than that. I wish I'd been brave enough to just go in and pry some answers out of him, but despite my curiosity, I was a little too freaked out to do so. I just popped a sleeping pill and went to sleep. I found out who he was at breakfast the next day. A family friend, like I'd thought, who'd got into trouble and needed to stay here for a few days. I asked why he had to stay here and not a hospital, but they just fobbed me off with an answer about him not having anywhere else to go until his Airbnb in the town was ready. I didn't see him at all, really, except in the evenings when he turned up to dinner. Abby was just as freaked out by him and made her feelings on this random guy's presence known, but her apprehension didn't last long. He was really charming, you see, really neat and intelligent. Charming as hell. He knew all the best ways to fire back at Abby with a quick-witted response when she got snarky, and seemed to understand all the best ways to gain her respect. Soon, it wasn't her and me sat sullenly at the end of the table while my parents discussed current affairs and philosophy and whatever, but her chipping in with her opinions too. It was only listening to those two talk that I realised how smart she was. I think our parents were really proud to watch her engage with the guy. He gave her stuff to read, and they spent hours talking. She went up to his room a lot, and I could hear them talking and laughing into the early hours when everyone else had gone to sleep. Don't ask me if I think there was anything going on. I don't want to think about it. I told myself that he wouldn't do something like that. Mum and Dad wouldn't let it happen either. They weren't stupid. I didn't get involved. No one even seemed to notice I was there in those weeks. I just slipped into the background. I didn't mind. I probably wasn't half as interesting to him, being a spotty, grumpy teenage boy and all. Anyway, eventually he did leave, much to my personal relief. But he didn't leave our lives. He turned up periodically every week to dinner parties. I'd be forced to join for the meal, but afterwards I'd be excused and return to my room, hearing them talking in low voices well into the night. I learned to sleep with headphones on. Things went on like this for a while. A few months passed, and he was gone. Abby was really torn up about him, but Mum and Dad just told us that they were just as confused as her, and he'd gone away suddenly, without an explanation. He wasn't fond of tech either, so they didn't have a number to call him on, just a vague hope he'd eventually turn up again. I was very glad when he didn't. It seemed like things were going back to normal. Mum and Dad were, at least. Abby, not so much. Not at all, actually. She got weird, sad, intense. More intense than usual, anyway. She didn't want to debate with anyone about anything. She stopped going to school, stopped doing anything except smoking outside a bedroom window. She almost looked like she was going grey. Her eyes sunk into her sockets, and she started losing a lot of weight. My parents thought she was depressed and got her a therapist, medication, anything. I thought she was doing meth, but I never found any drugs in her room, apart from a regular weed stash. Soon, she wasn't doing much of anything besides lying in her bed, smoking. She turned her room into a hotbox, and my parents gave up trying to do anything about it, so the house constantly stank of bonfires. It was rancid. She was rancid. I started wishing the old bugger would return and pull her out of it. But no amount of wasting away and pining worked. So she started getting irritable, snapping at everyone. She'd lose her temper at the slightest thing, throw stuff, and once even threaten Mum with a knife. She snapped out of it, dropped it, and started sobbing on the kitchen floor. All I could do was cower in the doorway like a coward when I saw that whole thing from the next room. I'm not proud of it, but if you've never been in a situation like that, you can't really know how you'd react, so don't go judging me. I've never been a fighter. I can't say I wasn't going through it myself, watching my sister deteriorate like that and go mental. I started having panic attacks, hiding in my room even more, keeping a knife on me. But like I say, I was invisible. I shouldn't have worried, really. It all came to a head one evening when Mum and Dad got back from work, and she had locked the door to her room. They had to break it down to get in. I don't know how to describe to you what she looked like. She scratched up her arms to the point they looked like raw meat. Blood was smeared everywhere. The walls, the bed, the carpet. She was staring, vacant, just staring at the door. It was Dad who broke the silence with a little strangled noise. She leapt into action, literally leapt, pounced like an animal. She was snarling, shrieking, spitting, absolutely unrecognizable from the sister I knew and loved. I was sobbing, shaking, could hardly do anything as Dad wrestled her to the ground. It took both Mum and Dad to get her to stop spasming and writhing, but eventually she went limp. I just stared. They looked at each other, stricken, but then their expressions morphed into something else. Clarity, determination? I don't know. They eventually seemed to remember I was there and turned to tell me to call my friend and have him pick me up. When I came back the next day, Mum and Dad were waiting for me. They sat me down in the front room. I remember they were calmer than I ever could have expected, putting up a front for me when they were probably terrified themselves. They told me not to worry, that they'd restrained her. She was safe now. They'd had someone come and assess her. That if we told anyone what happened, they'd lock her up forever. And we didn't want that, because what had happened to her, it was unexplainable by science. And I knew from the way she looked that they were right. There was no taking her to anyone else. They found all sorts of occult books under her bed, dark magic, stuff like that. I told them with some conviction that it was definitely that guy that had upped and left town a while ago, but they shut me down firmly. But I knew he'd given her those books. I just knew, just like I knew I had a possessed sister in the attic. I'm ashamed once again to say that I didn't go up there for a whole 2 weeks. It became horribly easy to ignore the sound she made, the thumps, the howling, the sobbing. I put my headphones in like I had before and blotted it out. I cried. My panic attacks got worse. I prayed for God to put her out of her misery for the first time in my life. No such luck. It's amazing what you can get used to when you have to, what your brain blots out for you to survive. My parents had tried to keep up a sense of normalcy for my sake. In a weird way, it made us closer. They started actually asking about the stuff I liked, and I was weirdly chatty. I'd even come into their room sometimes when the banging started, and they'd let me stay like I was 5 years old again, scared over a tree banging on my window rather than my crazy sister in the attic. And every day, I thought about that man. What I'd do to him if I ever saw him again. It was 5 days ago that I finally snapped. It was a Saturday and my parents were out. The banging started up, the weeping, the moaning. I stiffened and reached for my headphones. But then I heard her calling out my name for the first time. Begging, pleading with me. She sounded so scared. And I just couldn't do it. I couldn't ignore it this time. Summoning up every ounce of bravery inside me, I made her a sandwich. My favourite, Nutella spread with the crusts off. I pulled down those stairs to the attic, legs jelly, and climbed. I'll never forget what I saw up there. The smell was putrid. It took everything not to vomit on the ground in front of me. Abby was soaked through, either with sweat, urine, blood, or anything else. I don't know what I expected, but seeing her physically chained to the wall wasn't it. I had no idea when Mum and Dad had converted our attic into a dungeon. It was almost professional. She was whimpering. I don't think she saw me at first, and I had to call her name 3 times from across the room before she finally seemed to see me. Whatever had been in her eyes that night when she went at Mum's throat. It wasn't there anymore. She sobbed in relief seeing me, and it all spilled out of her at once. That it was her fault to let her go, and the only reason she attacked in the first place was because Mum had been hurting her. That guy had changed them somehow. I just stared at her in pure horror. She kept talking, crying, begging for me to believe her. Of course, her speech was muddled and disjointed as she rushed to get her words out, but there wasn't even a hint of a lie in her tone. I don't know how long I stood there, not moving. I think I just willed myself out of my body, but there was no escaping this nightmare of a situation. Her pleas grew more incessant until she was screaming at me. I still didn't move, not an inch, not until I felt hands on my arms pulling me back towards the stairs, ushering me down them until I was on the landing. Mum and Dad had returned. I hadn't even heard the door slam. They hardly looked shaken. They had that expression of absolute calm. As I started to hyperventilate, my mother took me in her arms and shushed me, trying to calm me down. They reassured me that she was lying, whatever she said, that she was really sick and I didn't need to worry, to forget about it. They were calling a priest, to exorcise her properly, and it would all be over. I was so relieved to be out of there that I believed her almost immediately. Please don't judge me. I realized after all this how much of a kid I still am. A lot of kids my age think that they're invincible, that they've got no more growing they could possibly do, that they're independent and ready to take on the world. I used to be like that. I wanted my mum to be right. I wanted her to make it all go away. Of course, I wanted Abby to get better. I just didn't want to be the one to do it. And she said she had it under control, that she definitely would. They both did. The priest never came. The noises died down from the attic until they lulled completely. It was just me, Mum and Dad, sat at the dinner table quietly, and everything felt normal. It was like I fell into a trance. I don't even remember time passing. I just remember smooth, low voices, the smiling of faces of my family. Days blurred into weeks. I don't know if it was depression or something. I don't know what. It was weird. I was drained constantly, not even half myself anymore. I'm ashamed to say my memory even got spotty. Like I went long stretches of time having even forgotten about the memories of the past few months. I started finding weird rashes on my arms, like I'd scratched them to hell. Then, I started finding even weirder marks, like little puncture wounds all over my body, cropping up from time to time. Mum and Dad were cooing over me constantly, giving me anything I asked for, feeding me up so much that I started putting on weight. I say that like it's definitely a bad thing. But, well, eventually, I snapped out of it. I realized I'd gone days, weeks without hearing Abby. I tentatively asked my parents about how we were going to treat her, when they were going to call the church and get someone to help, or track down the old guy. But they just exchanged looks, and Mum gave me one of her glassy-eyed smiles. "Don't worry," she said. "You don't have to worry about her anymore. None of us will." I waited until they were gone to look. I went up to the attic, shaking, terrified. But it was spotless. No sign of the nightmarish setup from before. No chains. Only the faint smell of disinfectant. My sister was gone. And I realized what I'd done. What they had done. I turned the whole house upside down after that. I don't know what I was looking for, but I was desperate for any clues, any signs that I wasn't going insane, that my sister existed. Going through my drawers, ransacking them, I found something. stuffed right at the back. A small glass bottle full of dirt and weeds, and a picture of me stuffed inside. A weird-looking symbol etched in permanent marker on the side. It was then that I really started to freak out. Needless to say, I disposed of that thing before my parents could find them. It's the day after now. I'm still in my family home, and I haven't slept in 24 hours. Got to keep up appearances. I already feel clearer than I have since they locked Abby up. I've searched everywhere for those occult books of Abby's that they showed me, but I can't find them. I need some sources, some ammunition, or anything you guys have. Anything as to what the hell is going on. Either my parents are Satanists, or my sister was a witch and they murdered her. I don't know which is worse. I need to leave home. I know that much. But I've got nowhere to go. Nowhere, anyway, that they wouldn't be able to follow me to. I'm just a stranger on the internet. I'm not expecting anything. But, well, I figured it's worth a shot. Please, help me.